These are some of the most overrated albums of all time in my opinion, and just because I call an album overrated does not mean I find the artist overrated as well. In fact, most of the artists on this list I consider to be perfectly rated.
Damn, Daniel.
I keep seeing people holding this album in such high regard, and I just can't seem to understand why. Damn is clearly Kendrick's weakest solo album by a long shot. Releasing T-Pab and the amazing leftovers from it, Untitled Unmastered, and then following them up with Damn in 2017 was a big disappointment for me. Lyrically, it was nowhere near as dense, mind-blowing or intriguing as his other records at the time. Even now, I still think it's his weakest album lyrically. Sure, there are highs like Duckworth, Fear and Feel, but his songwriting on tracks such as Love is so underwhelming. Even though Zakari delivered a beautiful chorus, the lyrics on Love felt amateurish, making Kendrick lean more towards mainstream appeal than artistic value, something he hadn't done before. The same can be said for Loyalty, where Kendrick and Rihanna delivered the bare minimum. Damn also has the worst production out of any Kendrick album. Kendrick albums usually feature production that is adventurous, new compared to what he's done before, cutting edge or boundary pushing. But on Damn, there are a handful of cuts where he is just following what was trendy at the time, without bringing anything all that new or intriguing. Humble was fun when it came out, but it's such an eye roll to listen to now. It's basically Kendrick Lamar's Creep. The same applies to DNA. Even one of my favorites, Element, has a flat, uninteresting instrumental that is nowhere near as rich and detailed as your standard Kendrick song. Going back to Love, the instrumental is also minimal and dull. For reference, T-Pap had beats like Wesley's Theory, The Blacker the Berry, All Right and King Kunta. Good Kid Mad City had beats like Sing About Me, I'm Dying of Thirst and Mad City. Even Section 80 had High Power and Fuck Your Ethnicity. When comparing those beats to the ones on Damn, it's a night and day difference. Even observing it as an album on its own, outside the context of Kendrick's catalogue, there were still a lot of better rap albums released that same year, which got far less praise than Damn. One of my favourite things about Kendrick albums that keep me coming back to them is the fact that no matter how many times I listen, I always discover something new that gives me a better understanding of the overall concept of the record and what he is saying. But because Damn is so inconsistent in its overall narrative as well as in the quality of each track, I just don't care about that fun aspect. The concept of the album revealing a different narrative when played backwards is intriguing on paper, but its execution is confusing and unclear, ultimately coming off as a last-minute afterthought. I'm not trying to say that a Kendrick album has to be so high in concept to be good. GNX is certainly not that conceptual, but is still a great album. When I separate the lyrical highlights like Duckworth and Feel and compare them to the more straightforward cuts like Loyalty, Love and Humble, the gap in quality is so massive and hard to ignore. On Damn, crafting an album where the lyrical and conceptual tracks matched the quality of the more straightforward catchy cuts seemed like a challenge for Kendrick. Those catchier songs stick out awkwardly within the track list, often feeling like they were made for streaming numbers and mainstream appeal than genuine artistic intent. This is a balance Kendrick perfects on GNX, where tracks like the more accessible TV Off and Luther are just as addictive, impressive and true to his signature sound as the lyrically dense Reincarnated. Also, Kendrick singing on God is awful and annoying, probably his worst song ever. Yes, Duckworth is amazing and Steve Lacy's performance on Pride is still fantastic to this day, but the lows, especially Love, Loyalty and God, feel like abandonments of what made Kendrick such a profound hip-hop artist in the first place. I'm not saying Damn is terrible, it's still a decent project with some great songs, but I see many hip-hop fans rate it far too highly and turn a blind eye to its obvious flaws simply because it's Kendrick Lamar. Listen, 50 Cent's Get Rich or Die Tryin is of course not a trash album, and it's certainly not mid or anything below that either, but is it one of the best hip-hop albums of the 2000s, let alone of all time? Not even close. I don't even think it's the best rap album of 2003, and when looking at the bling era of the early to mid 2000s, there are better albums that came out of the scene that gets nowhere near as much love as Get Rich or Die Tryin does. Purple Haze is way more consistent and has better production. The thing about Get Rich or Die Tryin is that it's really the hits that carry the entire track list. Many Men, In the Club, Pimp, 21 Questions, and If I Can't are all great, but many of the deep cuts completely pale in comparison. Bloodhound has aged poorly, and for a rapper whose most praised attribute is his knack for great hooks, not every hook here goes that hard. The one on Poor Lil Witch is pretty annoying, the beat sounds pretty gross too, and the hook on Gotta Make It to Heaven is one of the weakest. The vocal melody in the hook of You Not Like Me is just a worse version of the intro to Many Men. It's not a bad album, but it's not the mind-blowing masterpiece that too many people think it is. I can't deny the significant cultural splash that tracks like In the Club and Many Men made, but I also can't ignore how forgettable and uninteresting the deeper cuts are. It's also a pretty long track list, especially when you count the bonus tracks. There are a handful of filler tracks that should have been cut. There are just better albums that represent this era of rap in a more rewarding and deserving way than Get Rich or Die Tryin.
Shut up, Ringo.
Don't get me wrong, I love the Beatles. They're easily one of my favourite bands from the 1960s. Their discography, especially in the later half of their career, is outstanding. However, Sgt. Pepper's always stood out as a bit of a sore thumb for me during their mid to late 60s era. I do think it's still better than most of their early 60s output, but it's far from flawless. People often describe it as a groundbreaking masterpiece, but I can only see that description applying to the album closer A Day in the Life and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. For the rest of the tracklist though, I don't quite feel the same. Even on the stronger tracks like Getting Better or Lovely Rita, they still feel pretty standard for a 60s pop rock song. There were also other more groundbreaking, boundary-pushing psychedelic albums that came before Sgt. Pepper's, like The Velvet Underground and Nico, and Pet Sounds. While Sgt. Pepper's is still a good album, I find it a disappointing follow-up to the mind-bending experience that Revolver was. Aside from With a Little Help from My Friends, A Day in the Life, and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, I don't really see myself ranking the other tracks, even if they are still good, among the band's greatest songs. I'm not even sure they would crack the top 50, while albums like Abbey Road, Revolver, The White Album, and even Magical Mystery Tour each have multiple tracks that could make it into the top 30. Overall, I find the rest of the Sgt. Pepper's tracklist to be good, but nothing more. They're not amazing or outstanding, just good. It's not a consistent listen. You're basically getting a run of either good or mediocre songs, with only one truly outstanding track at the end. In contrast, other Beatles records give you a steady run of amazing, even incredible songs, with the outstanding tracks sprinkled throughout instead of just one. If you were to remove A Day in the Life from the album, just that one song, the drop in quality across the entire record would be colossal. No other track could compensate for its absence. Whereas if you were to remove Here Comes the Sun from Abbey Road, tracks like Something and Come Together would still make it a near perfect album. If you were to remove While My Guitar Gently Weeps from the White Album, it still has Helter Skelter and Happiness Is a Warm Gun to make up for it, and so on. You get the point. As good as With a Little Help from My Friends and Lucy are, it's still not enough to make me ignore the fact that the entire tracklist is basically being carried on the back of A Day in the Life. The album just lacks the consistent high-level quality found in other Beatles records, and when looking at the overall concept of the record, with the Beatles performing as this fictional band, it still doesn't feel all that well executed. The last thing I want to point out is that Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane were, I believe, originally meant to be on Sgt. Pepper's, but the label was so desperate to keep the Beatles releasing music consistently that those songs ended up on Magical Mystery Tour instead, which sucks to think about because if those tracks had actually been included on Sgt. Pepper's, the album's narrative would not only make more sense, but it would also have 3 flawless songs instead of just one.
Hello, I'm Tom York.
While The Bends is obviously not Radiohead's most acclaimed album, the amount of praise it receives from both critics and audiences is, in my opinion, pretty over-exaggerated. It is not a 10, and it is not the 138th best album of all time. And it's definitely not better than these albums, especially Journey in Satchidananda. When looking at 90s alternative rock albums as a whole, Siamese Dream is easily the better record, yet it's placed lower than The Bends for some reason. What I find The Bends to be is a good alternative rock album where Radiohead does a good job incorporating the trends of their time into their own music and sound, but it's not adventurous, not groundbreaking, and certainly not one of their most consistent albums either. On the other hand, the records alongside it often are adventurous, groundbreaking, and more consistent. Looking at its placement on user-ranked sites like Album of the Year, it's listed above albums like Mystic Styles and Different Class, both of which were game-changing and influential in their respective genres, while The Bends is just a straightforward good 90s rock album. It doesn't come close to the impact of these albums or Radiohead's later work. Sure, there are great songs on it. Fake Plastic Trees is incredible and it features one of the band's best album closers, but when compared to the best songs from OK Computer, Kid A, In Rainbows, or even A Moon-Shaped Pool, it doesn't feel nearly as mind-blowing. I see this record similarly to how Nirvana released Bleach before Nevermind. Bleach is a solid album, but it clearly left room for improvement and served more as a stepping stone towards the game-changing Nevermind that followed. The same goes for The Bends, a stepping stone to OK Computer. It makes more sense for The Bends to receive the same level of praise and attention as Bleach, but for some reason, the over-exaggerated praise The Bends gets completely overshadows the recognition Bleach receives, even though both fit in the same category of straightforward, good but flawed 90s rock albums from bands that would go on to release far better work. There's really nothing about The Bends that makes it more mind-blowing than other strong 90s alternative rock albums from the same era.